This video is going to illustrate the TM Pro test management software, and the purpose of this software is to schedule product tests. In other words, the products that you're manufacturing may need to be tested on an ongoing basis to meet your client's requirements, and so this product is for that purpose, and it will maintain historical records of all the products that are being tested. And we'll begin by going through the process of setting up a test. So to do that, we can either go through the menu system, File, and from the drop-down list, click on Test. You can also get there by using the toolbar buttons up at the top here. This would be the Test toolbar button. Either way, we end up in the Test Detail window, and there's already a product in here that's being tested. This is actually the test ID for one of those existing products. We're going to set up a new test by clicking on the new toolbar button, and that clears out all the fields for us. And then we'll set up the actual test ID. Let's say it's called test -001. Now, in addition to these tests, we can also have a group of tests that are put into what might be called a program. So for example, if your customer wants you to do multiple tests on their product, like to do an electrical test on their product, if it's an electrical product, plus a weather test, maybe some sort of salt spray kind of test and humidity and so on, you can have multiple tests that are grouped together into what's called a program. We'll come back to this topic in a few moments. We're just going to focus on the individual test right now. So we'll continue with this thing called test-001 and the description of the test. Let's say this happens to be an electrical type of test, and we want to cycle through turning it on and turning off the product. So we'll call it electrical cycle. That's the description. Now, the test can either be performed by a test lab, like an external test lab. So you can send out the product to let's say, an independent laboratory, and they would then test it for you. So we would click on external here. But let's say we actually have the test fixture in-house, and we're going to use our internal resources to do this test. So we'll just leave it at internal. The duration of the test, let's say it's going to be 48 hours of cycling the product on and off. And the actual test will be just to cycle this particular product on and off. Now the test itself can either be active, which is what we are currently showing here with a check here, or it could be inactive, which means it won't show up on the lists of tests that are due down the road. If we say, what tests are due in the month of, let's say, November 2018, if it's an active type of test, it will pick up all the tests that are due. If it's not active, then of course it won't. Now, moving on a little further here, we have some settings related to how often we want the test performed. So for example, the frequency can be in units of day, week, month. Let's choose month. And let's change this to 3. So we want to do this electrical cycle on and off test every 3 months. And when you're first starting out with this particular test, you need sort of a springboard or a starting point. We call this the startup date. So it's going to take 3 months, add it to whatever we have here, and then give us the corresponding date that the test is due. Once you start recording some tests as being done, then it'll use the last test date and add 3 months to that. But we can either backdate this if you wish. If you want your test done on, let's say, 3 months from, let's say, February 15th. So you could change this to February 15th, 2018 as a starting point, add 3 months to that, and it would then give you the corresponding due date. But we'll leave it at the date that's shown here, which happens to be the system date, the current computer system date. And then we click on the Save button up here. And so now all of this information has been saved into the database. And we can also see when the next test is due for electrical cycle. This test -001 is due 3 months from March 2nd, which happens to be June 2nd, 2018. Now on the right hand side here we have some tabs here that you can see. The very first tab is called Custom Fields, and these fields are optionally you can use them optionally if you wish to reflect some of the terminology in your place that you like to record. For example, maybe you might want to know who the customer is for this kind of test, and let's say it happens to be Toyota, and we may want to know what the engineering standard is that we're going to be using against this particular test. So let's say this happens to be engineering standard -123, and there are 3 other fields that you can set up if you wish, or you can just leave them blank. So we'll set these up, and that'll be it for now. Now these fields can either be unique to this particular test, or they can be set up at a global level, which means they'll always appear, the field names will always appear here, and you can enter whatever you want in the field content. So for example, another test might have a customer, and it might be, you know, General Motors, for example. But for this particular illustration, we'll keep it unique to this particular test. And then the other thing that's useful is later on when we want to go into reporting, we can filter on, for example, let's say we want to know all the tests that are due in the month of April 2018 where the customer is Toyota. So you'd be able to filter on that kind of thing if you wish to. So let's go ahead and save what we've done so far, and now all that now is in the database. Now, in addition to these tabs, in addition to the custom field tabs, we have a tab called Picture. So the picture could be anything really. It could be a picture of the test fixture that's going to be used to do the cycle testing, the electrical cycle testing. Or it could be the picture of the product that you're going to be testing. So for example, let's say we want to tie this down to, you know, the specific product. So if we go in here, I have a folder called Picture, and we're going to be looking at, let's say, a rear auto tail light, which is the picture that we see here. And so now we can go ahead and save that as well into the database. And then we have a tab here called Instructions, and a tab here called Parts, and a tab here called Target. So the instruction can again either be unique to this particular test, or it could be more of a global type of instruction, which would mean that it would sort of apply or be available to other tests. Let's say we're doing a bunch of electrical tests, so there's maybe 15 of these kind of tests, and they're all basically the same. So the instructions could be picked up from what we call the global instruction table, and that way you wouldn't have to type it in each time. So let's go ahead and set up the instruction first at the global level, and then we'll come back to this test detail and be able to continue by picking it from a list of instructions. So we'll just close this out for one moment. Go back to File, Instructions, and so we'll go ahead and set up an instruction. And let's say we call this test instruction -001. And if you want to record the revision information, let's say it's 1.0, and then we kind of just type in the details of what the test is going to be all about. So for example, we'll place light in fixture TL-001. And then we're going to attach electrical leads to terminals. And then we're going to reset and so on. You can continue as it's totally free format. You can add as many lines in as you wish, and we'll go ahead and save that into the database by clicking on the Save Toolbar button. Okay, so now we have this particular global instruction in our database, along with all the other global instructions, if there are any more. We'll close this and we'll go back into our test. So now if we click on the instruction here and we click on the list, drop-down list, there's only one instruction here, the one we just added. So we'll just go ahead and double click on that, and it picks up that instruction ID along with the revision information and the actual instructions. And if we click on the Apply button, now this particular test instruction is tied into this particular test. And if we had, like I said, 15 other tests that were similar, you can just, from the drop-down list, select the actual instructions. So that's the instruction, how you set it up, and also how you tie it into the actual test. Now we'll continue with the next tab, which is parts. Now you don't have to enter anything here, but let's say we're going to actually do this test on multiple parts. So, let's say there's a part number called PN-001, and there's a part number called PN-002. So we have two parts that are actually rear tail lights that are going to be run through a test like this. And we click on the Apply button to kind of save that. And so now these parts are tied to this test. And finally, the last tab is a target. Again, this is optional as far as entry of information, but if you want to utilize this, the description is, let's say the test is such that the tail light will be on for 45 seconds and it will be off for 15 seconds. So that's sort of how this cycling is going to happen. On for 45, off for 15. And we're going to take three taillights, three parts, and test them in our fixture. And the target for this will be 2,880 cycles. So 2,880 cycles. So we want to be able to go through at least 2,880 on-off kind of cycles without the light burning out or frying on us or so on. And the unit of measure, in this case, will be cycles. Okay, so that's the target. And then we would go ahead and click on the Save button, and now we've got basically everything sort of filled in for the test detail. And so the next step will be to look at how one gets various reports out of the system. But before we get to that, we were mentioning this program possibility of tying multiple tests together into a program. So why don't we go ahead and, since we've already set up this test and there's another test already in the system, let's go ahead and set up a program type of activity for these multiple tests. So this would reflect the tests that are to be performed for a customer's product over time. So we'll go back to File, Program, and now we're going to set up a program type of ID. So that's, again, this is totally optional. You don't need to have a program associated with a bunch of tests, but for the purposes of illustration, we'll do that. So for Toyota, for example, there's a program called P-001 as an example. and this is for Toyota, let's say model XYZ. And here we're going to say all documentation to be forwarded to the central QA office. Okay, I mean, it's free format. You can add as much text as you want here, but that's sort of what we're going to do for this program. And then we would click on Save. And over here, again, we can have a picture associated with this program. So typically, this would be the actual product that we're looking at, which would be a rear tail light. But we'll leave that alone for now. Now, in order for this to sort of get populated, this part here, the assigned tests, we would go back to File and Test. And now we're going to assign a program to this test. So we go ahead and click on the drop down. There's only one program, the one that we just set up. So we'll click on that, and that now ties this test into this program that we've set up. And we'll click on the Save button. And let's go over to, actually, we didn't put a comment in here, so why don't we do that? Just to complete this particular test detail. So let's say our comment is we must contact customer if test requirement not met. Okay, and we'll go ahead and save that. So now for this test, we pretty well populated all the fields that we want to, and we've assigned a program for this, like this particular test is part of this program. And we can go look at, let's say, another test, test-002. This happens to be already in our system. This is an environmental test, and we're going to expose the tail light now to, let's say, a salt mist for 2 weeks in a test fixture. Again, we're going to do it internally. So, you know, all of that's been sort of populated prior to us coming to this video. And again, we're going to assign this test to the program P-001. So we're going to be doing two tests. If we're calling this P-001 our program for Toyota, we're going to do sort of an electrical test, cycle test, as well as an environmental type of test. We'll go ahead and save on that. And now if we close this and we look at program, we have the one that we've set up here, plus these parts have now been assigned to this program. And so that, in a nutshell, is how one sets up the test and takes those tests, if they wish, and put them into a program associated with a particular customer, like, for example, Toyota. And that's it for this part of the software. We'll stop here, and then we'll continue with recording a test once it's occurred and the results of those tests. This segment will focus on the transaction section of the software. The transaction system provides the mechanism to record any activity for a particular gauge. And one can get into the transaction window either by clicking on a toolbar button up here, or we could go to File, Transaction. That takes us into the transaction window, and here we have for our test ID T-001 that electrical cycle test that we set up earlier. And we actually have some history, although it wasn't shown in the video. Someone had come in here and at the request of our customer, for example, there might have been a request to do the test for whatever reason. So that would be considered an unscheduled type of test. And in this case, it was done on the 15th of February. And some other information on that particular transaction. We can actually look at a transaction by double clicking on the row, and that's gives us this window here and just gives us some additional information. So let's say we actually want to do a scheduled transaction now, although it's not scheduled in this case, but let's nevertheless do a scheduled transaction. So to do that, we would click on New, and that takes us into the transaction detail window. And let's say we did the transaction on this date. We actually did the test, and we have the type of transaction is scheduled, and we can say a few things about the actual test. So we could say, for example, that the test cycle requirement was met, and we can also record some environmental conditions. These are actually user definable, so you can change these to whatever you want them to be, and there can be up to 5 of them. We actually set up 2 in this case, temperature and humidity. So let's say the temperature was 22 let's say degrees Celsius, we'll use that scale, and the humidity was, let's say, 70%. We can also record some results associated with this particular test. As you recall, we were going to cycle this light fixture, this rear tail light fixture. We're going to turn it on for 45 seconds and turn it off for 15 seconds. We're going to use 3 parts, 3 of these light fixtures, and we wanted to have a minimum of 2,880 cycles without any failures. So the results can be recorded here. Let's say we had 3,000 cycles on the first part, and let's say we had 3,500 cycles on the second part, and let's say we had 3,200 cycles on the third part before failure. Although we're not running it to failure or wanting to run it to failure, but let's say this is what happened. And so now if we click on the apply button, it adds one more record to our transaction history, the scheduled one, which happened on this particular date. And we should probably say who did it. So let's go back into that record for scheduled. Let's say Bill was the person that actually was in charge of that particular test. And so now we have a second record. The first one was unscheduled, the second one was scheduled. And now if we look up here, we see that the last scheduled test was on this date, March 2nd, 2018. The frequency at which we want to do this test is every 3 months, so that takes us to June 2nd of 2018 for the next scheduled test. And that's pretty much how we record on an ongoing basis the results of a test, and we'll build up history as time goes on. And the next thing we'll look at will be actually some reports related to tests. Okay, let's have a look at some of the reports that you can get out of the system. We do that by going to the menu item called Report, and from the drop-down list you see various reports that are available. Some of them are grayed out, meaning that you actually have to be in that part of the software to get the report. So for example, the test detail report would be when you are actually looking at a test detail. And we'll look at those and the others as well. There's a item here called Report Options, which is the first item on this drop-down list, and this allows us to filter and manipulate the reports that we wish to see. So for example, one can either filter on a particular program and say, give me a list of all tests associated with a particular program, for example, by filling in the from and the to here. You can also sort some of these reports by different elements, like for example, the default is by program, but you can do it by, for example, test ID and so on. We can also select a date range that we want to report on. So for example, let's say we were interested in getting an idea of what tests are required for a particular month, if that's what we're interested in. So let's go over here and maybe pick June, and the year we'll leave at 2018. And then we click on the OK button, and that goes back to the database and retrieves all those items that are due in June of 2018. So now if we go back to the report element here and we look at for example, the test due report, we can see the various tests that are due and when they're due. So for example, test-002 is due on this date, June 6th, 2018, and the type of test that is an environmental test. It's part of the program that we had set up. In this case, we called it P-001. So there are actually 3 tests that are due in the month of June for this particular program, and there are 2 tests that are due for this particular program, P-002. So this is sort of the way one would get out the various tests that are due in a particular point in time, or overdue, or if you want to do it ahead of time, next June, for example. We can also look at this from a matrix point of view by clicking on what's called a test schedule report. And so this gives us an idea for the month of June, what tests are due for each program. So for example, the program P-001, we have 3 tests and the date that they're due. So for the electrical cycle test, that's due on June 2nd. And for the environmental test, that's due on June 6th. Now, as it turns out, this particular test, the environmental one, is going to be sent out to an external lab. So we just identify that with a key of a sort of an O, or an O. And it's an external lab test, and an X would be an internal lab test. And so this would be external, this would be internal, and the other test, the mechanical test, is due on the 15th of June, and that's going to be an internal test as well. This report and all the other reports can be printed out by clicking on the print button here, for example, and they can also be sent to an external file and emailed, if you wish, to somebody. If you want to send somebody an email with this particular report, you can also put it into a PDF file if that's what you'd like to do. And so that's what's called a test schedule report. And moving along here, we can get a list of all the tests that are in the system. And so this gives us an idea of what tests are in the system, and the last test date, the due date, and the interval or frequency at which we want to do these tests. So that's sort of the test list report. And we can also get sort of a history of tests that were done. For a particular test or for a particular month, we can see what tests were done. So for example, let's go back to report options and click on the reset button. So we'll reset all the filtering, and we'll go back to the range tab, and this time we'll enter a date range. So let's say from the beginning of the year of 2018, January 1st, 2018, to let's say March 31st, 2018. So for the first quarter of the year, we want to know what the history was for various tests. So now if we go back to the report and look at the test history, we see that there are actually 5 records. This is the first one of 5. And this happens to be for test 001, which is the electrical cycle test. And there were 2 entries associated with that time period. For that period, the first quarter of 2018, there was an unscheduled type of test, which is represented by this U/S. The date it occurred, which was February 15th, and just some information related to that test. Then there was a scheduled test for the electrical test, T-001, and that happened on March 2nd, and again some general information is shown here. So this history report will likely build up over time, and you can always get an idea of what has happened over some period of time. If we look at the other tests, so now if we click here, this takes us to the second test, which is an environmental test, and the information associated with that happened to be a scheduled test, which happened on March 5th, and so on, with some descriptive information. So that's called a test history report, typically for a period of time that you would select, whatever that might be. And then we also have a test list by part number. So for example, if we go into report options again and click on reset, and let's say we want to get a report of the tests that are associated with various part numbers. So for example, let's say part number 001 and part number 002. So for these two parts, we'd like to know what tests are associated with these two parts. And now if we go back to report and test list by part, we would see the report test list by part number. And for example, for the part number PN-001, there are 3 tests that we're going to perform on that part, and they're part of the program ID of 001. So the program, general program is P-001. There are these 3 tests that we're going to perform. The type of tests they are, the last date on which we perform that test, and then the due date for that particular test. And then for part number PN-002, it's still part of program-001. We're also going to perform an electrical test on that part, and so on. So that's the test list by part number report. And so now we've looked at these various reports that are available to us at this point. Now let's have a look at some of the grayed out reports. So for example, let's go to the program list report. If we go to, for example, the program P-001, there are 3 tests associated with that. And if we want to actually get a sort of a report that you can print, you would now you can see that it's actually active. And we click on that, we can see for this particular program P-001, these are the tests that are associated with that particular program. This is for a particular product from Toyota Motor Company, and the tests that we're going to be performing are shown here. So that's sort of a program test list. The other report that might be of interest is a test detail report. So again, in order to get that report, we need to go into the test detail. In this case, let's say for T-001, which is the electrical cycle test. Then we click on the report menu item, and you can see that the test detail is in fact active. And you can see the details of that particular test described here, including the instructions that are associated with conducting that test. So this is the test detail report that you get when you have the actual test detail up on the screen. And finally, there's a transaction detail report. So again, it's grayed out at this point. We would need to actually go into transaction, which we can do by clicking over here, for example. And that brings up test-001. There are actually 2 tests that we did here. One was an unscheduled test on February 15th, and the other one was a scheduled test on March 2nd. So now if we click on the report menu item, actually before we do that, we need to go here and call up that particular transaction. For example, this scheduled transaction. Now if we go to report, you can see that the transaction detail report is active. And if we click on that, it just kind of prints out the entire transaction. It's, if your customer's requesting a test certificate, this is what you would supply to that customer, which more or less describes the test and the results of the test, and also a statement, if you wish, related to that test. This statement can actually be user modified. Obviously it needs to be user modified, and so in this particular case this person signed off on this test, and you could then print this or send it as an email attachment to your client or your customer as a test certificate. And so that, in a nutshell, are the various reports that you can get out of the system. And that's pretty much all I want to talk about for now. So thank you very much for watching this video, and have a good day.